right, welcome everybody to Resiliency Rounds with Jeremy and Anish. We are discussing the Nicomachean Ethics. This is the Aristotelian lectures series that he used to deliver to noblemen, and the thought here, for based on what we know about Aristotle, was he wanted to train the next generation of leaders to go on to build these republics, the philosophical republic that Plato talks about in his works, that is the Republic. And the reason why we here in Resiliency Rounds, Jeremy and I, are reading these texts is because these are the texts that are laid out in the Foundations of Moral Obligation course. It's a series of books that help us, humans, rational beings, make decisions when there is a lot at stake. And so, in order to make decisions, life or death decisions, decisions that impact the common good, it is important to be able to base those decisions on some foundation. Another way to look at this is one needs to have a certain set of tools or a philosophical toolkit in order to be able to navigate such choices and make the right decisions. And so the Foundations of Moral Obligation course is one such course that has both Eastern and Western lines of thought that help us build this toolkit. And so the Hellenistic works are part of this, and the Aristotelian ethics, or the sorry, Aristotelian works, that's the Nicomachean Ethics, is one of the important early texts that one needs to read in the Western line of thought that can help us kind of build this toolkit. And so, where we have come to so far is the start of book three. So book one, book two, and then now book three. And then the in book two we had he had Aristotle had described what were the virtues that were intellectual virtues, and then uh, um, non-intellectual, which were related with passions. And there was a certain um, how do I say, like a stepwise approach to how do you then develop virtue? How do you start on the path of virtue? And so we had discussed some of those steps. The step one was to be guard against pleasure. And then step two is practice going toward the extreme of a certain passion that is not not how do I say, um, that is not in line with one's nature. And then as you start going towards the other extreme of that virtue, you and away from what is not in our nature, we will hit upon the mean of that particular virtue. So if one is not is not brave, one should start kind of moving towards doing acts that may be considered in their minds to be rash. And then you would at some point go from not being brave to being rash, but at some point you will come into the median of that virtue. That mean or the median of that virtue is courage. And so you would have hit upon courage. So those are the steps. And then all of these actions that one takes, and when while we are talking about virtue or making the right decision or making the right choice or walking in a certain direction, these actions have to be actions that we do voluntarily and and not involuntarily. And so uh, this brings us to the one of my favorite parts about the Nicomachean Ethics, which is voluntary and involuntary actions. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Jeremy, and Jeremy can walk us through some of the next steps.
Yeah, great intro, Anish. So, right. So now we're talking about really moral responsibility requires actions to be voluntary, right? So Aristotle spent some time defining what voluntary and involuntary that therefore means, and voluntary for Aristotle's defining voluntary actions as requiring internal causation, right? So we internalize this is something that we do because we want to do it. um, and that it's not based on external pressures or forces.
Right.
Um, and and this is and there's a shift, right, from involuntary, but I think we need to define involuntary first. Um, but there are a lot of social forces that influence and shape oneself, and those are often what leads to involuntary actions.
Yeah.
How
You're
does
talking
that
about
sound?
convention, right? You're talking about kind of convention, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So do you feel like most of our actions are involuntary actions? Do you get that feeling?
Uh, I I do. And I think that we are very much influenced by all sorts of social pressures, norms, culture, um, the different emotions that are influenced by outside factors. That all of these things are involuntary. And interesting, I think it's actually a great segue into also talking about vertical too, because most people will find themselves in a certain stage. Most people don't advance really beyond certain levels of development as adults. And and those people are often stuck probably in a cycle of involuntary actions.
Mm. Can you describe a little bit about the vertical structure first, if you don't mind?
Yes. So for today, so in the past, I've talked about Torbett's model of vertical development. I wanted to introduce Robert Keegan's model of adult development, which Robert Keegan's a Harvard professor. He's written tons of books and theories on this. These two, Torbert and Keegan are both kind of pillars in the space of adult development. I think Keegan studied under Piaget. So these are really great thought leaders in the process. And so to bring it back to adult development at its core is development is not a static condition. As we move through adulthood, it is not static, it's constantly moving. We continue to develop in how we make meaning throughout our life. And so if we think about adult development as how we make meaning, it's in sense making throughout our life,
Hmm.
we shift from focusing on things that happen to us to things that we can then do, right? And that might be a poor example, but he uses a theory of what he calls subject object shift.
Hmm.
And what we are subject to is what's embedded within. We're unable to reflect on it. It just happens to us. We don't know about it until after the fact, right? And we'll get into. I mean, there's a lot of connections into this book, which is why I want to bring it up. But what we can then take object as, though, is something that we notice, that we can reflect on, right? So subject, something I don't notice; object, something I can reflect on, I understand, and I can take perspective on.
Mm.
Does that make sense as
Yeah.
two concepts? Okay. So as we move from one stage to the next of development, we're going from subject to object eventually, right?
Mm.
So stage one is just early childhood, impulsive mind. Most people move through that in childhood. That's very trend, that's I live based on impulses and immediate needs, right? So
Mm.
most of us will definitely move through the impulsive mind. Um, but then stage two is what we call the instrumental mind, right? And that
Mm.
people make meaning of the world based on like concrete, self-focused, rule-driven, rules and rewards,
Mm.
right? So right and wrong is determined though by my self-interest. What do I need? What do I want?
I see.
Right? And so relationships here are very transactional,
Hmm.
and they're focused on compliance and rules, whether
Mm.
you're breaking those rules or following them. Um, and then you move to stage three, which is where many adults end up kind of remaining for most of their life. And this is where it gets to involuntary actions I'm speaking of, which is what we call So stage three is, the way in which we make meaning of the world is defined by the expectations and beliefs of others. So before it was my needs, and now though I'm able to see that other people are actually guiding how I should behave and what I should be doing. And those
I
are
see.
norms, that's family, that's culture, that's organization. So all of a sudden, my identity and how I function in the world comes from the need to belong and to be approved,
Ah,
right? I need approval. I need to
yeah,
belong. We all need to belong into groups, right? I mean, that's human
right.
nature. Um, and so you begin to internalize values, but those are not your own values. Those are the values of others,
Yeah.
right? So in the end, in this space, you're prioritizing harmony. You want to follow the rules. You want to follow the norms and expectations of society, right? Um, and then we move to stage four, which we call the self-authored mind. And this is where all of a sudden, you're making meaning of the world by having your own internal ideology. You have your own values. You identify your identity. Um, is what guides your life. It's
Yep.
not external factors anymore. So here you start to be able to build multiple perspectives. Anish has his perspective. I have my perspective. Anish has his identity. I have mine. They may, we might find that we align in different places, but they are yours and they're and mine are mine, right?
Mm,
Um, and you have multiple perspectives of, in that like create more of a coherent worldview.
mm,
So you have a strong sense of personal agency here.
mm.
For in fewer people achieve this self-authored space, right? And as we get into talking about involuntary and voluntary, we might be able to argue that voluntary is the self-authored space.
Mm.
And in here, in terms of like real world examples of stage four self-authored minds are those who have a vision, who are strategic in their thinking, who can see a bigger picture, who have a sense of purpose and mission that are not just driven by, again, external factors.
Mm.
They are identifying these themselves. And then stage five, lastly, is self-transforming. And very few people kind of reach this space, but it's, you're making meaning by recognizing all of the different worldviews, including,
Yeah.
my own worldview, and that there are other they're partially, my worldview is just a partial construct of what the worldview really is. And I haven't
Right.
actually, I can continue to grow that. And so I might have multiple identities or ideologies. I understand I can sit with complexity and say that there are lots of ideologies. There are a lot of ways to view this scenario and this situation, that you're comfortable in chaos and constant
Yep.
change. You recognize it is a natural part of life, and so you're not you experience it, you sit in it. Identity then is now fluid, and you're independent of all external kind of factors.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. And it's there's a logical progression as you go through this. The one of the inflection points where one could hear this and say, well, I don't make my decisions based on what the world is telling me. I make my decisions based on what I know to be the truth. And so it it is not this is not a competition, it's not about who is in which stage.
Right.
One has to really examine one's thoughts and actions and choices and look at it from a different lens, a lens of self improvement, using the toolkit, and then figuring out if the way one thinks, acts, chooses is in line with convention, or pleasure or selfishness, or is it in line with the common good or the universal happiness? I think that unfortunately for most of us, we don't find ourselves questioning the way we believe, or sorry, not way, the way we choose, the way we act, the way we think. We stop questioning it because we start believing that we are good agents and our actions are good actions, and where whereas what it turns out is most of us are in fact ignorant
Yes.
and don't understand the true nature of our actions and our thoughts, because we lack knowledge of how things are going to turn out. And so, if one doesn't have knowledge of how things are going to turn out, one's decisions are not voluntary. And if one is not making voluntary decisions, well, then they are not in that post conventional stage that you mentioned. That was stage four, I believe.
Stage four, right?
Yeah,
Self-authored. Yeah.
self authored. I do believe, though, that the stage after that, where one can comfortably hold many different worldviews, sometimes contrary worldviews,
Hmm.
and one's own views are fluid,
Hmm.
is also hard to describe as a third person. What I mean to say is that it is number one is first looking at yourself with a lens and figuring out if one is in stage three or stage four.
Right.
If you're in stage one, stage two, it gets very hard to know, anyways. There's no insight really.
Yeah.
The lens, as you move from subject to object, what was subjective before becomes object later on is what ends up happening in my base. Listening to what you said, that's what it looks like. And the reason for that is, in my mind, the way I'm looking at it is that the lens keeps moving inward. Um, what was in the past not controllable
Hmm.
by someone was probably because one lacked the skill sets to control one's own thoughts, emotions, and actions and look into it, be introspective. And once, as someone learns that, maybe that's what leads to changes from one stage to another stage to the third stage and then to the fourth. And that between the third and fourth, that lens goes so inward that one can then look at and figure out if, in fact, the decisions one has made comes from their own sense of what is right and wrong, or does it come from the societal sense of what is right and wrong. But I think those stages can be looked at from a neutral third person and say, okay, I can see this person progress through this.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, and so the most difficult one is between, in my mind, I feel between third and fourth.
Hmm.
But it gets very easy to spot four and five. And as a matter of fact, it's actually very frustrating to go for most people to encounter somebody who's in stage five,
Yes,
especially
it
if
is.
that person is in decision making roles.
Yeah.
And so decisions, in my mind, most of the ones that we have to make are binary decisions. Yes, no, it's very rarely are we okay with a maybe decision or both and decisions. And I feel that once you go from stage four to stage five, you're in a place where yes, you can make decisions, but the conviction to stand behind that decision falls off just a little bit because one comes to understand that no decision is in fact the right decision. Both decisions work, and in the universal scale of things, none of them matter, as a matter of fact. And so it gets very hard then it's frustrating. It's easily identifiable, but very frustrating.
Yes, they can live with paradox, and they can understand polarities,
Yep.
right? So recognizing that this is actually not a problem to be solved, it's something that we have to live with both and experiences, and that and that's something where you get into higher level of operating in organizations and stuff too, where you have to recognize that there's a polarity in terms of because operational thinking is conventional thinking. And so it's
Absolutely.
easy to say, well, we need KPIs to measure this and to do this. And of course, and that fits into our norms and our way of thinking. But then it's questioning, well, why are we doing
Right.
the things we're doing? Is that going to get us to where we want to be? And where do we want to be in 5 years? And where do we want to be in 10 years? And what's the impact of what we're doing now on not just our company or where we are in our community, but like, does this have greater impact everywhere else? I mean, I was on a hike today with Miles, my older son, and there was a sign that said it takes 450 years for one plastic bottle to decompose. And so we started a conversation around
Yeah.
why is society allowing this?
Yeah.
Why are we as a human race saying this is a good idea? Let's continue to make plastic bottles and use them on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And without even thinking about the impact of us now, which the whole research on microplastics in our system, like we're all so that is conventional thinking at its best. We're all kind of marching along on this path based on stated, unstated norms and beliefs. It's very much living in ignorance. It is very much living in an involuntary world of, in this. And so I don't know, it's fascinating. And by the way, this is a side note, but Miles, he's 17, asked me if I knew what, about Plato's cave
Yeah.
today,
Oh,
because we
wow.
got deep and honestly, I was like, you know what? I actually, can you explain it to me? And so he explained it to me. And if we're going to talk about it, I'd love for you to explain because I bet you could do a better job than I. But the reason why I'm saying this is because Plato's Cave is an excellent example of moving through vertical development and
Yes.
understanding how you open up one's perspective,
Absolutely.
right? So everyone else is looking behind, right? Um, so I
Yeah.
don't know if we want to go there at all, but it was really fascinating that my 17-year-old was making this connection with me. And yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I would encourage Miles to go take the long road through the Republic because the cave allegory is nestled inside of the Republic for a reason. And so, these allegories people end up taking out and then discussing and talking about.
Mhm.
But it loses its impact if it's not read in the line of the Republic and going through. But it's beautiful, and we have the cave allegory in one of our episodes. I don't remember which one, but it's in the Republic. That's beautiful. First of all, at that age, it is. I'm just so stoked that there is a the interest in philosophy.
Mhm.
These concepts take many years to solidify, and but young people should be exposed to it, not for any other reason. This is not indoctrination. This is nothing. This is just realizing that there is a way to think, and this the way to think has been set down eons ago, and there is a way to a good life, and you may not agree with it, and one should not agree with it. One should go through life and be knocked about a little bit, and then one comes to understand that, okay, hold on, this way that I think is the right way based on my passions and my interests and my is the subjective stuff that I cannot control. So you slowly realize, wait a minute, that is controllable. Oh, wait a minute, there was a text that I had read. Let me read it again. And when you read it again, you arrive. It's like you break through this layer that you didn't even know existed. You thought that this space that you see around you is a space and there is no other space. And then you suddenly break through and you go to the next layer. You bring your old self with you and you climb this vertical development ladder. But you can really accelerate that by going back and reading some of these allegories again. The cave allegory means something different. Obviously, going through the Republic, it would mean something different to you in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s, and 50s, 60s as you go through life,
Yeah.
if you do it right.
Yeah. And so just a plug on these conversations, right? So we have these conversations, we now record them. We've been talking about this for years, but back and forth here and there. having these conversations and even listening to these conversations, it creates a new perspective and way of talking and thinking in life.
Yeah.
Right, to your point of just reading the book in your 20s and 30s and 40s, and but this is part of it, of like talking through it and thinking through it. And what I so my son trying to figure out what he does when he graduates high school, and he might not follow the path that norms and expectations would suggest he should. And so the question, I bet you could guess what question I asked him, is what he should be thinking about as he starts to decide. But I said, look, why don't you just sit with what is a good life?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for you? And
Yeah.
why don't you follow your passions
Uh,
and figure out
good.
what that means to you? It doesn't have to be college. It can be whatever. It doesn't have to be, med school. Like you do, figure out what a good life means to you. And I said, you may never actually find the answer, but you might get to a point, and then you say, all right, this is a good life. And you'd be like, well, but maybe I need to do more. And maybe I
Yeah.
need, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so what you're asking him to do is be voluntary, take voluntary action.
that's right.
It's hard.
Self-authored.
Yes, it is hard, and and I think we should go into it now.
Mhm.
But I would say that there are, and so the reason why it's hard would be because you need three things in order for action to be considered voluntary action. So one is the power, then is the will, and usually people say that is enough for most action. Well, there's a third element here, which is probably the most important one, and that's knowledge, intrinsic knowledge of the specifics, not of the generality of things. And the third one, knowledge, is the most difficult one to acquire. Power either rests within or without. There's really no choice necessarily in that. If I am sitting in a car and there's a flood and my car is lifted out and it knocks into another person's car, I cannot say that I did anything. It's an act of God, as there's a reason why in most contracts it says that if it's an act of God, then there's no liability there. That's because the power completely lies outside of the individual or the entity.
Mhm.
And then there is intent or will. I think will is something that resides within us as well. We can choose to do something or not choose to do something, and so now will can be imposed upon one by someone else. That is possible, but for the most part, there's always a choice when it comes to will. And then but the third one, and so those two things, power and will, is what you will hear most people talk about. The third one, knowledge, intrinsic knowledge, comes with time as a complete knowledge, knowing all the whys, all the WHYs related to that particular action from now on till posterity, till the universe is done with, is very difficult to determine. And that's why complete knowledge is not possible for an individual to have. Now, one can have some general knowledge about an action, but like saying that if you drive fast, you could get into a wreck. That's dangerous. That's general knowledge. The having specific knowledge about how to drive fast is something that you get to understand if you take up race car driving and you do it very well, right? So Michael Schumacher understands how to maneuver a car at high speeds much better than us, and so he has knowledge. Now, having said that, even Michael Schumacher will keep improving that knowledge on how to do it in certain circumstances or whatever, and so even that, so that he's much further along in that spectrum than we are. But if we choose to drive fast, we are not performing a voluntary action because we cannot control, we don't have the necessary knowledge required, within certain tolerances, obviously, is what I mean. And so that's just a pithy example. But what I was trying to say essentially is that voluntary action requires power, intent, and knowledge. Power needs to rest within. Intent needs to exist. That means an intent. We intend to do the action, and we have knowledge of the particulars. Then we can say that this is voluntary action. In the absence of that, in the absence of each of these things, it is involuntary action. Now, if I look back in my life and I look at all the actions I've taken, right,
Right.
I find myself, if it's a scale, if I'm sitting on a scale, right, on one side is voluntary action, the other side is involuntary action. It's heavily weighted towards involuntary action, and and if I were to tell you the voluntary actions that I took, you could probably argue with me, and you would be able to convince me that even those are not voluntary actions because I didn't have the prerequisite knowledge, because I'm a temporary being, and I will not have all the answers to all the whys if you kept asking me why. And so it turns out involuntary action is big. Now, inside of this involuntary action, though, we should probably break down these voluntary actions as we go along. And so, first of all, before I go further, what do you think about those three paradigms, those three parameters, power, intent, and knowledge, as it describes voluntary and involuntary action?
Yeah, I mean, I think my opinion is it makes sense to me. I think in terms of sure, that's I think that the to your point, actually figuring out whether or not you have the knowledge
Right.
um, is highly questionable, right? So at what point do you ever know that you have that? So I mean, your example, race car driver, like what he knew 10 years ago and what he knows now are very different,
That's
right?
right.
And probably uses totally different strategy in terms of how he's driving fast and what kind of speed he's getting. And it's so so I wonder with knowledge, like, is it a disqualifier if you have some knowledge but not all? Is it, what makes it voluntary then if you're not. So where I'm struggling is because that his perspective, like the race car analogy is great, but like he had knowledge of, and there was training and there's experience as a young driver, and then as a seasoned driver, you have new experience and new knowledge that's gained. Both are voluntary though, right? You have power and intent and knowledge as a young driver. It was there. So how does that shift?
It's a great point. I believe that this, if you look at the race car analogy, the fact that one is participating in the action with a view to improve, right? One is already walking in the direction of voluntary action.
Okay.
Now you can take this and you can look at life. If one wants to be a good race car driver, one wants to be a good human being. Race car driving is a very narrow domain,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are things that you can do, and you can recreate situations, and you can repeat those actions over and over again, and you can gain knowledge exponentially. Being a good human being is a very wide domain, and so all the necessary learnings along the way, the knowledge, the tripping up of taking an action, learning the consequences, learning from those consequences, taking the next action. This is how one builds wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and this blend lends really well to your analogy of the vertical, because wisdom is not knowing everything. Wisdom is being able to make the decisions despite having incomplete knowledge. And that is within a realm. It's called practical wisdom. You learn as you make mistakes, you learn, and you're wiser later if you do the thought, action, reflection, action. So that reflection part is the key, and that is the introspective part. That's what takes you from the subjective to the objective, takes you from the lower steps to the higher steps. And then and the fact that one is walking on this path requires one to realize in stage 3 that one is ignorant.
Right.
The first step in stage 4 is understanding that one doesn't know anything. That's when you start taking the next step. That's when you say, if I don't know anything, let me find out, what does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to have a good life? And then you start walking in that direction. And you still think it's kind of binary. Like, you could get there, you could not get there. But what eventually happens is, as you start gaining practical wisdom, you transform to the next stage when you realize you're never going to have the entire picture. You're
Right.
never going to know everything. There are certain things you should definitely not do. Those are all the places you got tripped up. So you don't do those. And you keep refining yourself, and you keep going, following on the path of virtue towards the goal. You never reach, you never achieve virtue. You're always walking in the direction. And it's
Right.
walking in that direction that leads to eudaimonia. Remember, we had this discussion in chapter one.
That's right. So this might take us off topic. I don't think so. I think it's along these lines, but and I lost it. So we can keep moving. All
Yeah,
right.
well,
I'll come
if
back
it
to me.
comes
Yeah.
back, probably the most profound thought, and you lost
It might have been. Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So the effort of looking within. So this was described by Nietzsche. So he has these stages of development as well. It's called the camel, the lion, and the baby. And so he says we are all camels. We are all walking with this burden of convention, and we don't shake it off. We don't do anything. We just like camels. We just take it. We just keep walking with the burden. We think that this is the only way to be. Till you have this understanding that no, this conventional life is not the way. There's something different, and that's when you transform into the lion. The lion questions why is this, why is convention this way, why should I do this, why am I being asked. It asks why.
Mhm.
And what the lion is doing is, as it's asking why, it is actually slaying a dragon. It's called the dragon. The scales of the dragon have "you shall not" or "thou shall not" on the scales, and "thou shall not." This is all conventional. Thou shall not do this. Thou shall not do that. And the lion keeps striking the dragon, and peels off all of its scales to kill the dragon. Once all the "thou shall nots" are done with, right? So the lion suddenly comes to realize the lion doesn't know anything, and then it transforms into the baby. The baby is like babies, like they're completely blank slate. That is day one of stage four.
Yeah.
You're saying, I don't know anything. And that's what a crisis, a good crisis, right, will get you to that point. If
Right.
done correctly, you can take any crisis. It doesn't have to be some cancer diagnosis or your wife leaving you. It can be something small in your day. You could start asking yourself, why is it that I'm in this situation? How come this problem keeps coming back at me? Maybe I don't know anything. Maybe the way I look at life is actually not the way I should look at life. That's day one. So if this is not it,
Mhm.
what is?
Right. In Torbert's model, we call that redefining stage.
Ah, I see.
Right. And then you go into transformative, and then you get into alchemical, which is more like the transforming in Keegan stage. But it's very
Ah,
much redefining where everything's wait, all of a sudden I know nothing.
right.
Yeah. So
Very
very
uncomfortable
uncomfortable.
being that stage. But
Yes.
that's where crisis comes in, and that's where you're willing to take up the toolkit. You
Right.
pick up the foundation, the moral obligation course. If I don't have the foundations, how can I make the next decision now?
Right. So this was my thought that I had lost earlier,
Ah, there
which
we go.
is the idea of or the concept of having a moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
Is that developed? And if it's developed, it's influenced by involuntary actions and then potentially continues to develop over time into voluntary actions. But like, it, what do you think about that in terms of where a moral compass comes in? Because you're shaping, and we might need to define involuntary too, by the way, which might be
Yeah.
helpful in this.
Yes.
But
Yes. We
um,
should.
yeah,
I like the compass analogy. It's like the problem with the involuntary action, the compass that one has, that one believes is a moral compass while they're taking involuntary action. There is a magnet that they don't realize that they have, and that magnet is convention. And it is pulling them, the north on that
yeah,
is pulled towards that magnet. They believe they're walking in the right direction. We all did. All this involuntary action that we took, we never took it. Our intent was there. So even for involuntary action, you can have the intent, and it could still be involuntary. And that's why power and intent is not the only two things required for voluntary action. You need to have knowledge. You believe you want to do good for yourself. You believe you want to do good for your community. It just turns out that there's a magnet of convention, that is, your north is pointing in that direction as opposed to the true north.
right.
Once you get rid of the magnet, then it points to true north, and now you're walking in that direction. Beautiful analogy for the compass. Um, So coming to then involuntary action. So if the you have so power, intent, knowledge is required for knowledge, the particulars is required for voluntary action. So involuntary action is one may not have the power. That means they take an action in which the sense of power lies outside of them. It doesn't lie within, right? Like I gave you this example of an accident in a way, right? Where what your car just rolls down the hill. You're in the car, but you're not operating the car. The car just rolls down the hill and bumps into somebody. That would not be a that would be a problem, right? Um, so that is one such example. And then if so if say I could even give another example, like say sleepwalking. So you can have sleepwalking, and that could be a problem, right? And so you are not necessarily in control of your body. The power kind of lay outside of you, right?
Right.
Um, they would also argue. Someone could also argue that if someone put a gun to your head, right, and made you do something, would that then be would someone say that the power kind of lay outside of you, right? So in these situations, sleepwalking, a car is going downhill, or you're in a flood situation that I gave, right? In those situations, if there's damage caused, no one's going to blame you for it.
External forces
Correct.
right.
Similarly, if something good comes out of those actions, you cannot take credit for it either.
That's right.
Right. So
Right.
in the race car analogy, if you were to use the race car analogy, so if I'm driving a car, and that if I'm driving a car really fast, right, I don't know how, I don't understand I don't have knowledge of fast driving, but I end up reaching somewhere ahead of time or whatever, or end up winning a race or
Win the
whatever, right?
race. Yeah.
Right. And I don't know how I won it. Like I just drove fast, put pedal to the metal, and just turned out I won it, right? And they'll put me on a podium, they'll give me the award, and I'll be really happy that I did it. But it turns out that that action is actually not voluntary action. It's not the same thing as Michael Schumacher or somebody going around the track, knowing exactly when to step on the brakes, when to step on the accelerator, how to turn, how to hit the apeces, and he's done it over and over again. He wins a race. That is voluntary action. So you could just end up turning lucky. And a lot of times, if one doesn't have knowledge of the domain, a lot of times you end up getting where you wanted to go, and you end up for all the things that turn out to be in your favor, you take the um, you end up taking the credit for it. And if things don't go your way, you don't end up taking the blame, saying, you know what, I didn't know. And so that's what ends up happening with involuntary action. So if someone puts a gun to your head and makes you do something, right, one cannot be blamed for it,
Right.
right? So I think that's
Right.
voluntary manslaughter, involuntary, or whatever that comes up. Hold on, let me. I think my dogs are barking. I don't know if you can hear it. Just give me 1 second. I'm gonna get them to
Sure.
to quit barking.
Okay.
Found the innermost room in the house, and still, well, uh, so there is a situation where someone puts a gun to your head and asks you to do something, then you cannot necessarily say that that's actually voluntary action. However, in those situations, though, there is still a choice to be made. So if someone says, well, if you don't do this, I will harm someone that you love. Now, at the moment of you committing the action, you did actually make a choice. You chose the well being of your loved one or your own self over the action that is being committed, right? So there is a little bit of choice. Now,
Mhm.
if it is completely under compulsion
Right.
or ignorance, right?
Right.
Compulsion could be societal compulsion. Compulsion could also actually be your appetites, your pleasures. You did
Hmm.
something because you thought it'll make you feel good,
Right.
right? Or you didn't realize that what you were doing was actually bad action. That's ignorance.
Right.
So those are all involuntary actions. But if it's done under threat, it is a little bit of a mixed action. It's a little bit voluntary, a little bit involuntary. What I mean by voluntary is that um, one is making a choice between two things while performing that action. right? And one could choose to not perform the action and take the consequence,
Right.
correct? And what ends up happening in these mixed, or what I call um these mixed actions, which are kind of under threat, right? The That is where I believe like a lot of great acts are committed. So give an example. Socrates chooses to drink hemlock rather than stop practicing philosophy,
Right.
right?
Right.
That is, and the history is peppered with these kind of choices people made. Great revolutionaries will make that choice, will choose death rather than giving up on the cause.
That's
There-
right.
And it's not easy for common folk to do that.
Right. And here we're talking about mixed voluntary then, right? I mean,
This
that's,
is mixed voluntary,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
because it was under threat. One would not choose to drink hemlock.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Right.
one would not choose to die, but when one is presented with the choices, one makes the choice and then ends up suffering the consequences or committing terrible acts. Now, the act of drinking hemlock so that one can stick to their philosophical ideals is a great act, and and on which praise is bestowed.
Right.
But uh, under the under the threat of someone being harmed, one commits an unlawful act or kills somebody else. I mean, you see this in movies all the time, right? And they put a gun to the head of some their kid and say, "Go kill this other person." They go ahead and do it. In that, no, it's you don't blame them. You feel pity.
Right. Yeah.
See what I mean? You feel pity for that actor.
Right. There's certainly no praise there.
There is no praise there.
No.
But if the act is great, then there is praise. And so it's also important, and this is a great point, that it's also extremely important then to make sure that when one chooses to, in the situation where there is a mixed action,
Mhm.
that one does not end up choosing an action for which one would be pitied.
That's great. So, modern day example. Let's see. Is this are they pitied after this or not? Company's not doing well. CEO decides to lay off 40% of the workforce. I mean, let's talk. COVID. One of the
Yeah.
organizations I had formerly worked for literally reduced its workforce by 40%. Really tough call, but
Wow.
it kept the company alive
Yeah.
for to fight another day.
Yeah.
I look at that as a mixed voluntary action, right? It was a terrible thing that
Absolutely.
they had to do, but they could have just completely gone, like they could have closed the doors altogether, and therefore 100% of employees would be out, or they could reduce by almost half and say, well, we live to, fight another day. Now, is that a scenario where the CEO would be praised or pitied, or both?
I I think that either ways, right?
Mhm.
That this is not a truly voluntary action because it wasn't the CEO's intent to
Right,
fire people,
right,
or it wasn't his intent to be in COVID times.
right.
This COVID times is like an act of God.
Yep,
It's like there is the example they give you, and your example is a fantastic modern time example. The example they give here is there's a ship at sea and it's a storm, and
right.
you have all of this merchandise and you have to throw it off overboard so that you can survive and your sailors will survive with you. And if as the captain you would never think of throwing the merchandise overboard, and which would but you end up doing it and you save the ship but you lose the merchandise, but you're praised because you did the right action here. The right action in this case was saving the lives of your sailors.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah, in a company, it gets a little bit harder because one is sacrificing the employee for the company. Now, if this was in the field of battle for a country, one could talk about that in this light.
right.
War again is something that is not something you choose to do, you participate in, and there are choices one makes at war that could have this sacrificing the few for the many. But the your example is a little bit harder because there is the pain that you're causing a human being, and then for something that you are, you're saving, maybe if it's, if you're sacrificing the human for the goods, maybe, it's, I don't know.
Right.
um
Right.
Goods
Yeah.
as in the products of the company,
Right.
or so I
Right.
just can't tell. Beautiful point.
Yeah.
That's great. However, it is in those situations that you find yourself in leadership, and then how do you live with that decision?
Hmm.
You see, if one believes that that decision was a voluntary decision, or realizing that it was a mixed decision, you can then, the way one deals with it internally, not externally, not what it looks like externally. I mean, internally, one has the toolkit. One understands that these are actually, in fact, the way one should look at all action.
Hmm.
Then you can choose to either take praise or take blame. But the trick there is to not shirk the blame for firing the people, and then take the accolades of saving the company.
Right. There are choices to be made there after the fact that
Correct.
how you
Both of those
receive.
things are not open to you.
That's
Now,
right.
if you choose to not take the blame, you should not take the praise. People very easily take the praise for it. Oh, he saved the company, but are not willing to take the blame for having done that.
Right. Right. No, I love that, and I think that that's where I was trying to get to. That was the my question, and I think it's that neither. You
Neither.
shouldn't accept either, right? Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
right. And so the pressure that one could put on somebody to make them do terrible acts, right? If it is an unhuman amount of pressure, and then one is made to do those acts, on that is where pity, you end up feeling pity for that person. But there is always a choice, is what Aristotle is saying, that one could fall in that immense amount of pressure and still choose to do the right thing,
Right.
right? And those are great acts. One should really choose which way they're going to fall on that. Now, there are, but when it comes to this compulsion, involuntary acts, when we said involuntary acts are done under compulsion, or they are, or ignorance, right? Mixed acts are basically done under threat, but involuntary is under compulsion or ignorance. Compulsion, we had also said, is compulsion of appetites, of pleasures,
Right.
right? And then sometimes even noble acts are compelling.
Say more.
So, in order to be, if one is seeking honor, there is a drive to do acts that will which are considered honorable by society, and one would then perform those acts. But there's a compelling force there that's making you do it, and the reason why one is doing it is not necessarily the common good. It is actually honor. You see? So that is your stage three. When a person says, I am a good person and I choose to do these good things, well, is it because one wants to be called a good person by society? Or do you in fact believe that this is the path to do eudaimonia, where when you look into the mirror, the only person judging you is yourself, right? So compulsion can be convention, can be honor, can be something as base as appetites and pleasures. And so one really wants to make sure that what one is doing inside of this space is not being compelled as well. And then I'm going to go to the next one as well. So the other thing is that this is one of the most common examples that I used to even give myself. And I see a lot of people say this, that, oh, well, I performed this action, or yeah, people perform this action. This is just human nature.
Mm.
And when we say our human nature, we are talking about things that are actually under compulsion, and unwilling willing acts that are done under compulsion are usually, um, so it's like, if there is pain associated with those acts, right? It was usually compulsory acts. Someone forced us to do. We would not do acts that are painful to us. However, if it turns out that these were acts that were pleasurable, it is usually our own intent to have performed these acts. For either of those two things, we will say, oh, it was human nature. We are not willing to take the understand that it was ignorance on our part, or the fact that these things that we did, if the act that we performed under compulsion led to a noble end, we will happily say, oh, I was responsible for it.
Right.
But if it was an act that was compulsion and it led to pain, we will say, oh, well, that was obviously just human nature, or I was led astray, and or whatever, and won't take blame and won't take the blame for it. So another way to think about this is that most of our actions are in a life that is unexamined
Hmm.
are involuntary actions,
Involuntary. Right. Right.
or mixed,
Hmm.
right? I would say that even and this is Aristotle says this, that usually when it comes to involuntary actions that are under compulsion, he still makes a distinction between involuntary actions that are under compulsion and involuntary actions that are out of ignorance. Involuntary action out of compulsion is when the result is a painful result, and and involuntary actions that do not lead to a painful result are usually what he calls non-voluntary actions. He makes another distinction:
Right.
non-voluntary actions. And non-voluntary actions are ones that are not pain. You don't have a painful end to that. But most of the actions in an unexamined life are either involuntary or non-voluntary, and one should not take neither praise nor blame for them. If there is blame to be taken, the blame is the fact that one did not choose to examine their life, which is a choice.
Right.
What do you think of that?
I want to build on the ignorance piece too, because if one regrets after the fact, right, then are we defining that as that was then an ignorant involuntary?
If one realizes after the fact, yes, that's a great point. So these decisions have to be adjudicated in the moment of action. Because the opposite can also be true, saying that, well, now I know. So now
Right.
and it just turns out that this is now voluntary action. That doesn't work like that either. So
Right. Right. Yeah.
b- what were your thoughts on the timing of this?
Well, I mean, yeah, he kind of goes step by step here in defining these different involuntary and voluntary steps and actions and what to make of it. Um, and I think, I come back to kind of the bigger picture of, the idea of compulsion, which is, in simple, like, so in my mind, I'm trying to simplify it all, right? Um, and I think that the idea of compulsion, which is it's external forces, right? And ignorance is I just, it's this whole lack of knowledge. Well, I didn't know better. Um, and so I think in its simplest forms, it's, you know, things happen to us or just lack of understanding. And I'm thinking about how often we go through life taking involuntary actions. Um, it is probably happy, and I think that's also part of like developing of being able to reflect on that and saying, I mean, how much of this is driven by things that are constructs I've created based on external norms and factors.
I believe that pretty much most of my actions in my life have been involuntary.
Yeah.
and very few actions I could say truly voluntary.
Yeah. I think that coming to terms with that is part of moving beyond it, right? As difficult as that as that might be, but it would be a pretty interesting exercise to sit down and go through some of life's choices, little ones and big ones.
And then the same vein, one could say that for most other individuals too, their actions have been involuntary or non-voluntary.
Correct. Yeah. And that's where most people sit, I think, through their lives. Yeah.
It's the worldview that one would get, right? One would stop blaming other people for things because one would realize that their actions, they were also ignorant.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. I think um, acknowledging that we're all ignorant and that we don't know what we don't know is a step in curiosity and inquiry that leads us to figuring out how to take on more voluntary actions, which again, like the whole point of this is moral responsibility requires us to take voluntary actions, right? So coming all the way back to why we're talking about involuntary and voluntary is in order to live a moral life and to be morally responsible, one has to get there. Um, and I think what we're saying is most of us aren't there.
If there is one voluntary action that one can take is understanding that one should read, participate in discourse, try to align their life with these cardinal virtues,
Mm-hmm.
participate in the common good, because these are knowledge necessarily of the general, but it's kind of in particular. The reason why one is doing this is one realizes that throughout, millennia, whenever as long as humans have existed, there's been this draw about what is the good life.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been crystallized over time by great minds. And one doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. No matter what happens to humans, the constraints remain till we are turned into some immortal being that is half machine, half man. We would still have till that point, till we are mortal, lead a temporary existence, till we have imperfect. We have this. Um, we have the ability to create inside of ourselves a decision making through wisdom, understand the imperfect nature of our knowledge, and
Yeah.
then choosing then to kind of participate in that. And that is the only voluntary action one can actually take.
A word comes up to me for me here, and I think that Socrates was great at this. And I think we can argue that he was a wise man. He would argue against it, but curiosity, living a life of curiosity, is a life that gets you towards continuous growth, constantly challenging your own thinking, your and others' thinking, and in your own actions, and understanding why you chose to do an act and why you didn't, and to continuously learn to read these books. And so it's interesting. So um, this was part of the conversation I had today as well with my 17-year-old, which was my grandparents lived both 99 years old each, and both within 3 months, I think, of turning 100 when they passed. But to think of what in over a century, the amount of change that has happened in the amount of wars, death, experience, the rise of technology, and to remain curious throughout a century of all of this instead of what could be, because I would credit both of these people with being extremely curious and questioning, constantly questioning and saying, but it also being open to the newness of all of these new things in your world. I think it helps lead to this discovery of what a good life is.
Yes, one should be curious, but one should also not spend a lot of that curiosity on frivolous things.
Yeah.
As one goes through the decades, one needs to have a certain curiosity about certain things and not be curious about certain other things.
Hmm.
Childlike curiosity is good, but one should be able to channel that curiosity to the bigger questions in life.
Right. And I think that that's when I use the term curiosity, it means a lot of things, right? And it could be childlike curiosity, or it could be pondering questions around it, who is a wise, what does a wise man look like? Who is a wise man? Am I a wise man? And I'm never a wise man because someone else is going to be wiser than me, obviously. And or what is a good life? Or what is voluntary and involuntary? That is curiosity of asking these questions and pondering these things. Not always with the answers, but constantly looking curiosity with an attempt to improve. Um, Knowledge, experience, understanding.
It is the Nishan child, the
Mm,
child that has been through life as the camel and the lion, has slayed the dragon of thou shalt not, now is a child, and now has a childlike curiosity that stems from the fact that one doesn't know anything,
yeah,
despite having all the accolades of the conventional life.
right. Yes. Yeah.
Right? That was Socrates said. Socrates told everybody that when he went to the oracle at Delphi and asked who's the wisest man in Athens, they said it is Socrates. And it turns out that he says, I agree. The reason why is because I know I'm the only one who knows that they don't know anything.
Right.
Right?
Yes. I love. Yeah.
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 The only thing I can tell you is that the only knowledge I have is that I don't know anything. And everybody else here doesn't even know that. They don't even know that they don't know. Right? And so you start your journey there. And I think that is the key about wisdom. And you said, there's someone wiser than you. I don't think wisdom is a scale necessarily that you compare with other people.
Mhm.
It is just a scale that you compare with oneself. One can go through one's entire life, be very knowledgeable conventionally, but be
Sure.
unwise.
Yeah.
And that is a fate that one does not want.
Yeah.
That is a fate that you would pity somebody. You see a 75-year-old act like a 35-year-old, you pity that person.
Right. Right. No,
Right?
that's a good reframe. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one doesn't want to be in a situation where one is not getting wiser as time is going by. In order for that, one has to be curious about how one thinks. Is that the right way to think? How much does one actually know? Are my actions voluntary? Are my actions involuntary? If my actions are involuntary, can I take praise for these things? Should I be blamed for these things? Now, the one could get really lazy about this and say, you know what, I'm not going to take blame for anything that I've done. I've done some terrible acts in my life and I'm not going to take any blame from him because, I heard from these two guys that they're all involuntary actions.
Right.
So that's not how that works. Like there is still a decision once you come to understand the fact that you have taken involuntary actions. Well, you next now need to start taking voluntary actions, my friend. And for that, once one starts doing that, that is the crisis journey. One realizes the mistakes one has made and that they've not been aligned to the common good. There's been a magnet attached to your moral compass that has pointed you away from the true north.
Right.
And there are repercussions for that. And more such acts one has performed, the more one has strayed away from the path to eudaimonia. And when one is 99 and one is looking back at their life, one would be one when one is looking into the mirror and asking, am I a good person? Was this a good life? you know the further one strayed away, the longer one strayed away, the harder it is to look in the mirror and say, I'm a good human being. You see, you rather one rather remain ignorant through one's whole life, like the happy pig,
Right.
versus a sad Socrates. We
Right.
it is a it's a a comparison that must always stand the test of time. Like, well, who do you want to be? A happy pig or a sad Socrates? Well, the happy pig doesn't know that their actions are involuntary. They're just driven by appetites, right? But
That's right.
they probably, they suffer just like everybody else suffers. They're happy when they're happy. They'll be taken away by the tides of the ocean, and their ship is rudderless. They're just going ups and downs. They don't know why. Why they feel that way, have no control. They believe they know. They believe this to be the nature of life, as opposed to the Socratic individual who examines their life and realizes that there are voluntary actions to be taken, and at the end of it is unhappy in the sense they're as happy as one can get, definitely much happier than the 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 mindless individual, the pig that's wallowing in their own, you know, that the pleasure that one gets by being Socrates is much higher and much more elevated.
Right.
But there is still sadness in it because one wasn't born a Socrates. One wasn't born a Buddha.
Right.
You achieve this through time, and the amount of time one spends in a palace away from the what is happening in the earth around, away from suffering, shielded by everything. And the first time you see suffering, one has to make a reckoning about the fact that one has lived an involuntary life up to that point.
Right. Yeah. It's well said. And so where maybe we're not ready to go here yet, but so how how does then how does choice then come into this?
Yeah, I think we've been going on for some time. So I think what we
Yeah.
could do is, I think choice is great. We should probably talk about choice in the next episode. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think we've covered involuntary and voluntary well. I think, or maybe who knows, but I feel like we've gotten it down, and I think that I would just reiterate part of what we're discussing here too with the vertical and is this shift here from socialized mind, which really is, actions are driven by external approval, by shame, by norms, by force, uh, and moving and trying to shift towards this idea of voluntary, which is the self-authored mind, which is acting from my own internalized principles that I have control over, based on my values and my reasoning. And it's interesting as we walk through this. I mean, is this just one chapter or two chapters of like involuntary and voluntary, but there's so much there around just thinking about the concept here, big picture, and then in the weeds as he goes and starts to define involuntary. But there's so much there, and and to think through just these two concepts and hold those is it, it's it's more complex than I would think. I mean, it's simple in how you can define it, but to think about that and how do we actually live our lives is complicated and uncomfortable and really fascinating at the same time to explore that, right? And so I'm kind of coming back to big picture, but it's not getting through what he's talking about and then actually having to reflect on it and say, well, where exactly are we? Where do people really sit in this space? Is really, really fascinating.
Yes, and that's why it is important to read this. Number one, read the text. Number two, reflect on it and then discuss it. I think the discourse part of it is what is missing in a lot of people's lives, and I'm very fortunate to have you as an ally here, Jeremy. As I read through this, it makes it so much more uh, relevant, so much more fun. This is Nicomachean Ethics is a little bit dry,
Yeah.
but once one starts discussing it with a dear friend, it can really lend itself to a very fun journey. So I thank you so much, and I'm very grateful for your time that you're spending here with me
Oh,
and loving it.
yeah. Yeah. The feeling is mutual.
All right, so we're gonna bring this one to a close.
Yeah.